Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Here I would like to quickly give an introduction of the positive psychology, how it is understood mostly in the current times, and then we will move on to the cultural nuances and how role of yoga has emerged and eventually became part of this course. So, here I would like to mention about Abraham Maslow, Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi's work. Abraham Maslow obviously was much before the Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi's work. Abraham Maslow is mentioned here because he was the very renowned psychologist who did his writings in the 50s and 60s. Most of you must be familiar to his need hierarchy theory, but many of you may not also be familiar that he was the person who first time in a very articulate ways talked about holism, meta needs and the self-actualizing tendency of human being. All these are very positive in nature. He talked about holistic perspective of looking at psychology. He critiqued the atomistic functional view of the world and he claimed that he warned that psychology should not suffer from it and called for not only developing holistic perspective, but also developing research methods which can understand the human being in its holistic nature. And holistic means it cannot be reduced to stimulus and response, it cannot be reduced to simple few tendencies which someone has acquired in the childhood, and looking at human being as a dynamic, constantly evolving entity. He talked about the meta needs, which is beyond the basic needs, which need not be satisfied. He talked about self-actualization, and in order to fulfill the meta needs and self-actualization, human beings can forego even the lower level needs. These all things were appeared in Abraham Maslow's writing. But probably it was not carried out in a very empirical way, at least in the famous American psychologist paper of 2001, Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi point out that, and they say that Abraham Maslow and other psychologists who are termed as humanistic psychologists, their work at number one, it became much more self-centric, and number two, not much empirical inquiry was carried out to take forward that work. Whatever may be the reason, Seligman and his colleague were able to articulate the positive psychology in a very emphatic way. Currently, positive psychology, the aim of positive psychology is claimed by the leaders of the field as achieving flourishing, and flourishing is understood to be in terms of an acronym PARMA that stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning in life and accomplishment. So, positive psychology is a study of flourishing. Naturally, the well-being is reflection of flourishing, but it is not only personal well-being, it is relationship as well as meaning in life as well. It also aims at studying the conditions to flourish, conditions and processes that contribute to flourishing and optimal functioning of people, groups and institutions. So, here you see evolving from the humanistic psychology, positive psychology not only focuses on people, it also focuses on flourishing groups and thriving communities, evolving institutions. Naturally, as the emergence of the field itself is result of this process, this is not, and this is very different from treating illness. It is based on the fundamental insights that treating mental illness is not same thing as promoting mental health. It is very solution focused. It is not merely corrective and limited to offering solution only when things go downhill, but it is telling people what should be the attitude, what activities they can carry out, what interventions can be done to not only attain flourishing, but also retaining flourishing. In the recent review, they have identified 51 types of 51 different interventions systematically studied in the positive psychology. So, when this special issue of American psychologists about positive psychology appeared, it attracted major reactions, lot of positive reactions. Almost everybody welcomed this move of a field of psychology to study the things of life which makes it worth living, looking at the potential of human being, looking at the possibilities of the human nature. All that was widely appreciated. It was also critiqued on being very ethnocentric. So, there are large number of scholars who pointed out this, this aspect, and Christopher and Hickenbottom have captured the essence of many scholars who have mentioned about the ethnocentric perspective, not being inclusive nature of the positive psychology field, as was reflected in that particular issue, in that special issue, where 15 articles on different aspects of the positive psychology was published. So, what Christopher and Hickenbottom write, that current efforts in positive psychology are deconstructed to reveal an adherence to the dominant Western conception of self and its accompanying vision of the good life as personal fulfillment. So, they pointed out that there are many cultures which can have different notion of self, which is very different from the notion of self held by the liberal or neoliberal society of the Western world. Essentially, they questioned that positive psychology cannot be universal, or the way it is presented cannot be universal, because of three things. Number one, vision of world is different in different cultures. What is the vision of world? That's we are going to look at in the second, in the next slide. Notion of self is itself is different, which arises from the world view or vision of the world. Notion of self, what is self? That itself is different, that understanding itself is different in different cultures. As a result of that, the very conception of happiness and what makes good life also differs. So, how can there be a universal positive psychology, or if at all there is a need and there can be a universal positive psychology, we need to do more thorough job, we need to have more cultural perspectives, we need to have examining the basic assumptions of the current formulations of positive psychology more thoroughly, using cultural lenses to make it more inclusive, so that it can become more generalizable, or if I may use this word, more universal. So, first thing we look at the worldview. This notion of Christopher and Hickenbottom is based on the work of Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor in 1989 wrote a very interesting piece on modernity and emergence of self, and he talks about two types of worldview prevalent in the world. What is worldview? Worldview is basic assumptions, belief, values about how this world is and how it works. So, Taylor point out that different cultures have different worldview, and they can be merged and they can be summarized in a term called one tier worldview or single tier worldview and two tier worldview. One tier worldview suggests that world is what is visible, human being is what is visible, what is experienced, what is empirical, what is objectively verifiable, and the happiness and responsibility of the life is solely lying in the individual inner situation. It is on the individual where the responsibility of his or her happiness lies. That is the one tier worldview. But two tier worldview, which was prescribed by most of the cultures, particularly before modernization and so called enlightenment in the 16th, 17th century, it talks about two worldviews. It talks about two tier worldview. Greeks, Balinese and Indians, these three examples can point out this aspect. Greek, they used to believe in having a life of necessity, which is the necessary biological survival situation. That is one world, and there is another world, the world of called Eugen, which is good life, which is life of citizens beyond necessities, life of the citizen which makes society worth living. That makes the essential human nature of the humanity. These cultures are talking about more objective reality, which is more based on biological survival or at max social needs, and also a transcendental aspect of the world. These cultures also believe, and many cultures still hold that belief, that it is the transcendental reality which imbue the value and meaning to the mundane, so-called mundane reality. So, Balinese and Bali is greatly influenced by Indian culture as well. They talk about Sekala and Niskala. Sekala is again a reflection of the ordinary realm of everyday life experiences, and Niskala is the spiritual world. That is deeper level of reality that is invisible to the untrained, but ultimately determines what occurs in daily life. And what is sadhana? Sadhana is the process of unraveling that what Balinese called Niskala and Indians called Paravidya. Indians say Paravidya and Aparavidya. Paravidya refers to the higher learning. Para is beyond. Apara is not, which is not beyond, which is immediately accessible through our senses. So, para refers to higher learning, learning related to self or ultimate truth, that is transcendental knowledge. So, here the self is used, and Professor S.K. Chakravarti used it beautifully. He wrote that small self with small s and self with capital S. Self with small s is born by our identity, about our physicality, about our social circle, and governed by individual ego. Whereas self with the capital S is the real self, where nature, all the creatures and the whole cosmos is included. Realizing that thing, realizing that inherent oneness, what is called non-duality, underneath diverse form of nature, knowledge of that is called Paravidya. That governs the so-called mundane life, which is perceptible through our senses. And this culture believed that what is life is much beyond my sense perceptions. But studying that also is important, because we have to do the agriculture, we have to set up temples, we have to construct things, people have to build their family, society has to have norms, there has to be exchange of things, business has to be developed. So, Apara Vidya is also important. But that Apara Vidya is, in a very tentative way, we are calling it lower knowledge. It is not considered lower in Indian tradition, but it is certainly not considered ultimate. It is not considered that about which Rishi of Upanishad says that knowing which nothing else is left to be known. There is a story in the Upanishad where a child comes, where a boy comes after receiving education from his guru. He comes back to see his father, and father was working in a garden, and just while working in the garden, he looked at his son. He asked, okay, so have your education is completed? He said yes. And then father asked, but have you got something? Have you come to? So he says that, boy, we are Brahmins. By definition, Brahmins means those who know the Brahman, those who know the ultimate reality, those who have the access to Paravidya. So we are Brahmins, and we are supposed to have the knowledge of Brahman, and that is what is the ultimate knowledge. So have you known something that after knowing which nothing left is to be known? That aspect of Paravidya is the ultimate realization of human potential. That is why it is called self-realization. But that self-realization has S as capital, because that is the real self. Brahman is the real self. Atman is, Jivatman is, but a sense of self which is result of the sense of separation arising from ignorance. This aspect of the worldview, what Charles Taylor calls two-tier worldview, is present, was present, has been present in most of the cultures before modernization. But what is the worldview being prescribed in the existing literature of positive psychology? That is reflected in the form of definition of self, basic assumption of self is reflected in their work. So, positive psychology is currently largely based on dominant Western and particularly American ideologies. And Christopher and Hickinbottom write that it is clear that it is based on Cartesian distinction. What is Cartesian distinction? That is the thought given by that great scientist that subjective world and objective world are different. Realm of science is to deal with the objective world, objective reality. Anything which is not in the objective reality, anything which is not objectively verifiable is not the matter of science. So, it is not the matter of knowledge. It can be a matter of belief. Notion of fixed and essential self is also evident in the writings of positive psychology. Thirdly, it talks about meaning and values are subjective in nature, and person should be free to determine both the meaning of and means to pursue the good life. And Christopher and Hickinbottom point out different questionnaires, different psychometric assessment tools to study well-being, to study even flourishing, and then they suggest, they point out that though these questionnaires are having element of other orientation, they have the element of including so-called others, but what gives meaning to life is largely understood to be the choice of human being. There is no great meaning as such universally. It is human being and dependent on his tendency or her tendency to find something meaningful or not. So, the means to pursue the good life or happiness in whatever manner they choose, that is the basic assumption, and they should choose as long as, and they can choose anything as long as that do not interfere with the ability of others to do the same.